The Commodores sold over 70 million records. They put 3 consecutive albums in the Billboard Top 3, something no other Motown act ever did. They were so dominant, so untouchable at their peak, that the music industry itself started calling them the Black Beatles. Today, they are not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Lionel Richie is. The man who left them, enshrined. The men who built the foundation with him, locked outside the door. And here's what nobody wants to say out loud. The Commodores didn't fall apart because the music got worse. Their final Motown album won them their first and only Grammy. They collapsed because Gordy decided one name was more valuable than 6. And once that decision was made, everything followed that one name out the door. The producer, the label priority, the resources, the future. The other 5 just didn't know it yet. This is the story of how 6 brothers from Tuskegee, Alabama built one of the greatest soul groups in American music history, and how the music industry quietly dismantled everything they built, one calculated move at a time. Stay with me, because the ending of this story is not what you think it is. You have to understand where these men came from before you can understand what was taken from them. This wasn't a label creation. Motown didn't manufacture the Commodores the way a factory produces parts. These 6 men found each other on a college campus in Alabama, Tuskegee Institute, 1968. And if you know anything about Tuskegee, you know it wasn't just a school. It was a symbol, a historically black institution built on the idea that black excellence was real, was possible, and was worth fighting for. Lionel Richie, Thomas McClary, and William King were in a campus band called the Mystics. Another group called the Jays, Andre Callahan, Michael Gilbert, and Milan Williams, were playing the same circuit. After the Mystics won the campus talent show, and the Jays had members graduate, they merged. 2 groups became one. And that one group decided to open a dictionary, randomly point at a word, and call themselves whatever it landed on. They almost became the Commodores. William King has told that story laughing, saying they lucked out. And that detail, random, absurd, human, tells you everything about who these men were at the start. Not polished, not packaged, just talented people who genuinely had no idea what was coming. Now here's something nobody tells you about Thomas McClary. When the Commodores were trying to make the trip to New York to find gigs, McClary had to go convince Lionel Richie's grandmother to let him come. Because Lionel had another option on the table. He was supposed to go work in a bomb factory in Joliet, Illinois. Let that sit for a second. One conversation. One grandmother's decision. And Lionel Richie doesn't become Lionel Richie. They drove to New York. They played clubs. They hustled. And then they crossed paths with a woman named Suzanne DePass, a booking agent who would later become a vice president at Motown Records. DePass got them an audition as the opening act for the Jackson 5's 1971 American tour. The Commodores, 6 college kids who had never played arenas, were suddenly on stage every night, warming up crowds for one of the biggest acts in the world. And they didn't just survive it. They crushed it. Night after night, the Commodores went out there and left audiences stunned. By 1972, Motown signed them. By 1974, their debut album Machine Gun, a heavy, dangerous funk record, sold over 500,000 copies and went gold. By 1977, 3 consecutive albums were sitting in the Billboard Top 3. Nobody at Motown had ever done that. Not the Supremes. Not the Temptations. Not Marvin Gaye in that run. Nobody. And the Commodores did something even more interesting than just charting. They had range. Walter Orange could lead a crowd on the floor shaking funk anthems. Brick House, Too Hot to Trot, Fancy Dancer. And then Lionel Richie would step to the microphone, and the whole arena would go quiet, and he'd sing something like Easy or 3 Times a Lady, and grown men would cry. That balance was their superpower. That tension between fire and tenderness was exactly what made them extraordinary. Here's what you also need to understand, and this becomes critical later in the story. Every member contributed. This was not a solo artist with a backing band. Thomas McClary was writing. Walter Orange was writing. Milan Williams was writing. They produced their own records with James Anthony Carmichael, the man who had been with them since the beginning. They had their own manager, Benjamin Ashburn, a man so essential to their operation that the band literally called him the 7th Commodore. This was a self-sustaining unit, a brotherhood. And Gordy was watching all of it very carefully. Here's where the story starts to shift. And if you're watching carefully, you'll see it coming long before the Commodores did. Lionel Richie was always the most visible member. That's just fact. His voice was the one on the ballads, and the ballads were what crossed over. 3 Times a Lady in 1978 wasn't just an R&B hit. It was a #1 pop hit. It was playing at weddings. It was playing at proms. It was playing in rooms where R&B records didn't normally get played. And Motown noticed. In 1980, Richie wrote and produced Lady for country artist Kenny Rogers. It hit #1 and stayed there for 6 weeks. That's not a side project. That's a statement. The man could write across genres, produce across genres, and deliver #1s outside of his own band. Motown was looking at that and doing math. Then 1981 happened. Richie sang the title theme for the film Endless Love as a duet with Diana Ross. That single, and I want you to remember this name, Diana Ross, because it matters, went to #1 in the United States, Canada, Brazil, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand. It became one of the biggest singles in Motown's entire history. Rolling Stone called Richie one of the most commercially successful songwriters alive. And here's the detail that should make you pause. In that same moment, the summer of 1981, Lionel Richie became the first artist in music history to appear in the Billboard Top 10 simultaneously as a composer, a performer, and a producer, across 3 completely separate songs. Kenny Rogers' track, the Commodores' single Lady, You Bring Me Up, and Endless Love. 3 songs, 3 different artists, all in the top 10 at the same time. One man's fingerprints on all of it. If you're Gordy sitting in Los Angeles, you're not seeing a member of the Commodores anymore. You're seeing a franchise. Now, I need to tell you something about Diana Ross. Because this is not a coincidence. Gordy had done this exact thing before. In the 1960s, he had taken Diana Ross out of the Supremes, one of the most successful girl groups in history, and built her into a solo superstar. The Supremes continued. They had hits, but they were never the same. The machine had moved on. Gordy had his blueprint, and he'd proven it worked. And now, standing in front of him in 1981, was his next Diana Ross. According to Richie himself, speaking in a New York Times interview, he had lunch with Gordy and told him he was torn. He didn't know whether to go solo or stay with the band. He felt loyalty. These were his brothers. This was everything he'd known since a dorm room in Alabama. And Gordy looked at him and said, "Don't think it hasn't happened before." 5 words. That's all it took. Richie said in that same interview that in that moment it became clear to him that a path had already been set. That this wasn't even a new idea. The label had seen this coming and had probably been planning for it long before Richie himself had admitted it to anyone. Now ask yourself this, and this is the question that should be sitting in the back of your head right now. If Gordy had already mapped out Richie's solo path, when did that planning begin? And at any point, did anyone pick up the phone and ask the other 5 Commodores what they wanted? We'll come back to that. Because right now, in 1982, something else happens. Something that shifts the balance of the story in a way nobody was prepared for. The man who held the Commodores together in ways that had nothing to do with music, the man they called the 7th Commodore, died of a heart attack. Benjamin Ashburn, their manager, their anchor, gone. And 1 month later, Lionel Richie walked out the door. Let's be precise about the timeline here. Because precision is where the real story lives. Benjamin Ashburn dies. The Commodores lose their manager, the man who had been with them since those New York club nights in 1968. The man who knew their contracts, who knew the label, who had fought for them in rooms they never saw. He's gone. And then Lionel Richie leaves. The official story, the one that's been told politely for decades, is that there was no conflict, that it was mutual, that Richie left with the blessing of his bandmates. And to be fair to the record, Richie has never publicly blamed the Commodores. He's spoken warmly about them. The split, on the surface, was civil. But civil and fair are 2 completely different things. Here's what happened on the business side. Richie's 1982 debut solo album, simply titled Lionel Richie, sold over 4 million copies. The lead single, Truly, went to #1. And who produced it? James Anthony Carmichael, the same producer who had built the Commodore sound from the beginning. the man who had been in the studio with all 6 of them, who understood their music architecture, who had their trust and their history. He went with Richie. The Commodores didn't just lose their lead singer. They lost their producer. And that matters enormously, because in the studio, a producer isn't just technical. A producer is the person who understands your sound, who pushes you in the right direction, who has the institutional memory of everything you've built. Carmichael had that for the Commodores. And Motown allowed him, or possibly encouraged him, to walk out alongside Richie. Now the Commodores had to replace 3 things at once. Their frontman, their manager, their producer. They tried. They brought in Skylar Jett as lead vocalist. They regrouped. They kept touring. And in 1983, they released Commodores 13. It went nowhere. The album was commercially disappointing, and the reviews were not kind. Critics noted that the band seemed uncertain of its identity, caught between trying to recreate what Richie had given them and trying to find something new. Without Carmichael's production touch and Richie's songwriting instincts for the ballads, the formula that had made them the Black Beatles simply didn't work anymore. Thomas McClary watched this happen and made a decision. In 1984, he left. One of the co-founders. One of the men who had convinced Lionel's grandmother to let him come to New York. Gone. To pursue gospel music and a solo deal. And here's the detail that cuts the deepest. While the Commodores were trying to figure out who they were without Richie, while they were replacing members, rebuilding rosters, scrambling for a sound, Richie released Can't Slow Down in 1983. It sold over 20 million copies worldwide. It won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year. According to multiple sources, it became the best-selling album in Motown's entire history at that point. All night long. Hello. Penny Lover. Song after song after song, all produced by Carmichael, the same man who used to produce the Commodores. Think about what that image looks like. On one side, Lionel Richie, selling out stadiums, winning Grammys, appearing at the American Music Awards, where he won 4 prizes in a single night. On the other side, the Commodores, releasing albums that stall, watching founding members walk away, searching for a new identity, while Motown quietly moves its resources elsewhere. And now I need to tell you the part about Motown's contract terms. Because this is important and it doesn't get talked about enough. Motown was not known for artist-friendly deals. Multiple sources, including the Biography Channel's profile of Gordy, confirmed that Motown's standard contracts charged artists for studio time and that songwriters were generally hired as employees, meaning they didn't retain ownership of the work they created. Now, I want to be careful here. The specific terms of the Commodore's individual deal have not been made fully public. But what we know is this: the songs they made, the catalog they built, the recordings that have generated decades of royalties. The Commodores did not walk away from Motown holding the keys to any of that. Lionel Richie walked away with his name, his songwriting reputation, and a record label machinery fully pointed in his direction. The Commodores walked away with a question nobody was asking: what happens to us now? Now here's the part of this story that should genuinely wreck you. After everything, after losing Richie, Carmichael, Ashburn, and McClary, the Commodores went into the studio and made the best song of their career, Night Shift. The title track was written as a tribute to 2 artists who had died the year before, Marvin Gaye and Jackie Wilson. 2 men who had given everything to black music and never quite received everything they deserved in return. And the Commodores, 5 men who by this point knew exactly what it felt like to be undervalued, to be overlooked, to watch the machine move on without you, wrote that song with a depth that their earlier hits never had. Night Shift hit number 3 in the United States. It won the Commodores their first and only Grammy Award, Best R&B Performance by a Duo or Group with Vocals. The 1986 Grammy ceremony. The room stood up. And here's the irony that should land like a punch. They won their only Grammy after Richie left, after their producer left, after 2 founding members left, at the moment when, by every commercial measure, they were supposed to be finished. The song that saved them, even briefly, was a tribute to dead men who never got their due. You cannot write that kind of irony. Life wrote it for them. But then comes the part that confirms everything this story has been building toward. After Night Shift, after the Grammy, after proving they could still make something extraordinary, the Commodores tried to stay at Motown. They were working on new material. They had momentum, or at least the beginning of it. And then Gordy's label told them their album release would have to wait. Why? Because Lionel Richie was releasing Dancing on the Ceiling. According to the Encyclopedia of Alabama, which documented the Commodores' history in detail, the band left Motown Records over a dispute about the timing of their next release conflicting with Richie's album. Motown chose Richie. Motown scheduled Richie. And the Commodores, the group that had given that label some of its most successful years, that had put 3 consecutive albums in the Billboard Top 3, that had just won a Grammy, were told to step aside. They left the label shortly after. Think about how that feels. You've just won your first Grammy. You're trying to build momentum. And the label you've been loyal to for over a decade tells you to wait, because the man who left your group needs the promotional runway. I said at the beginning of this video that the Commodores didn't fall apart because the music got worse. This moment is the proof. They left Motown not because they failed. They left because the institution had made its choice years earlier, and that choice was never going back. By the late 1980s, Ronald Lawpred had moved to New Zealand. Milan Williams left in 1989. The group that had once been called the Black Beatles was now down to essentially 3 members, Walter Orange, William King, and new addition J.D. Nicholas, playing legacy shows, nostalgia circuits, casinos, and festival stages. The machine had moved on. And here's the question I promised I'd come back to, the one I left open earlier. When Gordy sat across from Richie and said, "Don't think it hasn't happened before," when he laid out that blueprint, when the decision was already made, did anyone, at any point, think about what would happen to the 5 men left behind? Did it matter? I don't think we get to answer that cleanly. But the evidence sits right there in the history. I want to step back for a second, because I think this story gets misread all the time, and I want to make sure we're seeing it clearly. This is not about Lionel Richie being a villain. Richie has spoken warmly about the Commodores throughout his career. In 2009, he publicly said he wanted to get the band back together. He's acknowledged what those years meant to him. He didn't engineer a conspiracy. He made a career decision that any rational person with his options would have made. But this is also not about individual decisions. This is about a system. And the system is what deserves the real examination. Gordy built Motown on a specific model, one that worked brilliantly for the label and frequently not well for the artists. Motown's contract structures, which have been documented extensively and which led to multiple lawsuits from artists over the decades, were built around the label's ownership and control. Holland Dozier Holland, the songwriting team behind some of Motown's biggest hits, ruptured with Gordy in 1968 over royalty disputes. The Marvelettes filed suit. Rick James filed suit to end his recording deal. The pattern was not accidental. What Gordy did with the Commodores wasn't unusual for him. It was the playbook. Find the star within the group, separate the star from the group, build the star into a franchise. He had done it with Diana Ross and the Supremes. He did it with Lionel Richie and the Commodores. The difference is that Diana Ross had the benefit of being Gordy's companion, a personal relationship that gave her a kind of protection and attention the Supremes never had. The Commodores had no such relationship. When Richie walked out, the remaining members had nothing that gave them leverage inside that machine. And this brings us to the deepest cut of this entire story. 70 million records. That's what the Commodores sold, as a group, combined, over the full run of their career. They have been inducted into the Alabama Music Hall of Fame and the Vocal Group Hall of Fame. As of the making of this video, they are still not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Lionel Richie was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 20. Thomas McClary, one of the co-founders, the man who convinced Richie's grandmother to let him pursue music, has spoken about this publicly. He told Smashing Interviews that the Hall of Fame operates on relationships and infrastructure. Sometimes if you don't have the various people that are blowing your horn for you, nobody else will. That's a remarkably restrained way of saying something very pointed. If you have no institutional support, no label machine behind you, no powerful figures advocating your name, you can sell 70 million records and still get left out of the room. Now let me bring you back to that contradiction I hit you with at the very beginning. 3 consecutive Billboard Top 3 albums. No other Motown act achieved that. 70 million records sold. A Grammy they only won after being gutted. And still not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, while the man who left them holds the plaque. You now have the full picture. And I want to ask you something directly, because I think this matters beyond the music. How many times in American music history has a group of black artists built something extraordinary, watched the infrastructure around them extract the most commercially valuable element, and then been left to gradually disappear while that extracted element thrives? The Commodores are not a unique case. They are a pattern, a well-documented, recurring pattern in the music industry that goes back decades. The names change. The label names change. But the move is always the same. Find the star. Separate the star. Move the machine. Leave the rest to figure it out. The Commodores figured out how to survive it. They are still touring. Walter Orange and William King still perform. They still play Brick House, and the crowd still loses its mind. And if you go see them tonight, they will give you everything they have. But the Grammy is won. The Hall of Fame door is still closed. And the man on the other side of that door sold 90 million records after he walked away. Here's the last thing I want to leave you with. In 1985, the Commodores stood at a Grammy microphone and accepted the only award their group ever received. The song was called Night Shift. And in that song, they sang about artists who had given everything to the music and had never been fully seen for what they gave. Marvin Gaye, Jackie Wilson, men who built something real. Men who the industry leaned on, profited from, and in various ways discarded. The Commodores wrote that tribute from experience. Not in 1985 the way we understand it in retrospect, but the emotion was already there. You can hear it in the record. There's a kind of ache in Night Shift that doesn't come from craft alone. It comes from knowing something, from living something. And maybe that's the final word on all of this. The Commodores sold 70 million records, and their story is told primarily as a footnote to Lionel Richie's biography. Gordy built one of the greatest music institutions in American history, and the architecture of that institution was designed to concentrate value at the top, not distribute it among the people who created it. Richie thrived. The machine worked for him. And none of that is a reason to root against him. His music is real. His talent is undeniable. But you can hold two things at the same time. You can celebrate what Lionel Richie built. And you can also look at what the Commodores built and what was quietly taken apart around them, and say that deserved better. They deserved the Hall of Fame. They deserved their name on the door. They deserved to have someone at that label blow their horn when it counted. What they got was one Grammy, a scheduling conflict, and a slow walk off the stage. If this story sat with you, if it made you feel something, share it. Because the whole point of channels like this one is to make sure the full story gets told. Not just the version that fits on a trophy. The Commodores were the Black Beatles. And most people under 40 have no idea who they are. That's the real tragedy.